Leon, thank you very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. Good morning, and to the listeners and viewers.
All right, so let's start with this interesting piece that you wrote, and you called it This National Dialogue a Costly Illusion. Take me through what you mean by that.
Well, let me just preface my remarks by saying, we shouldn't prepare for every contingency except success. So if against expectation, mine and others, this national dialogue actually produces some worthwhile, actionable, I need to stress that adverb, actionable plans that can get the country out of the rut it's in, then, I would be in support of it. But I must say, the impression I have, and it's obviously an impression because we haven't even started the first meeting yet, is that this is an enormously expensive talk shop exercise, which in many ways, whatever its merits and whatever its aspirations, is really not an alternative to what the government should be doing, which is to govern the country in terms of the mandate that the governing parties received at the election last May. That's the purpose of having a government and people voting for a government or voting against a government. So we now have a very expensive parliament in South Africa. It's got 490 members. We've got hundreds of provincial legislatures. We've got thousands of municipal councillors. And I think, the taxpayer, overburdened as he and she might be, would be forgiven for thinking, well, why do we have all these well-paid legislators at all three levels of government if they, in fact, can't conduct the national or the local conversation in place of some kind of rather amorphous citizens' body or many bodies which will do it? I could just add as well, without getting too much into the weeds of the thing, that as you would know, Peter, part of our municipal legislative infrastructure provides for so-called ward committees. So, the thousands of municipal wards from which municipal councillors across the country are elected, actually have citizens' committees that are meant to deal with problems on a day-to-day or monthly basis. So then you've got to say, superimposed on top of all this is now a national dialogue, which, I'm all in favor of people having discussions and coming up with plans. That's fine. That's part of the democratic discourse. But is this a substitute for government? Is it complementary to the government doing its job? And you would know, and I guess many of the listeners will, that just this week, or in the last few weeks, but this week particularly, we've got an extraordinary lapse of government. We've got the chief of the defense force goes off to Iran, apparently on an unsanctioned trip, imperils South Africa's very fraught relationship with the United States with his remarks. Whether they were approved or disapproved by his political chief, we have no idea. We've got a provincial police commissioner in KwaZulu-Natal, one of the most important provinces, who basically alleges that his own minister and various high-ups in the police force are in collusion with criminal entities. We've got taxi mafias, we've got construction mafias, we've got a serious academic saying South Africa's a mafia state. So you would think, whether these criticisms or observations are valid or invalid, that government's job is to address these things instead of having a very expensive national conversation about things that we already know or on plain sight. So that's, where I come from. And I'm very happy to be proved wrong in all these observations, that somehow out of this process or processes, we will emerge, like the chrysalis and the butterfly, with something that really is going to be impressive and actionable.
Having been in politics at a critical time in South Africa's history, you would have been part of and seen national conversations in the past geared towards building the country and a new dispensation. I'm just wondering, is there anything different about this one, and or could there have been lessons learned in preparing for this one from what we did in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Peter. So let me just start by saying that even if you are a huge supporter, cheerleader for this national dialogue, you would have thought that some of the founding spirits of it, who come from the age you were describing, like Thabo and Mbeki, the former president, and these so-called legacy foundations, who've expressed, well, actually are boycotting the opening a national convention today, that their views would have weighed on the organizers of the national dialogue. In other words, there was a clear push not to proceed today and tomorrow, but to delay matters until all the objections and objectives had been better finessed, and that didn't happen. So I think the rush to have this conversation starting today, instead of in a few weeks' time, when you might have been able to meet some of these objectives and objections, would have been more prudent. But that is not the course followed by the presidency or the group who are organizing it. But going back to where your question's located in the previous national conversations, if you look at some of the language and the imaging around this current national dialogue, you'll see we've borrowed and transposed a lot of the nomenclature from the constitutional dialogue and, in fact, negotiations we had in South Africa, really on and off between 1991 and 1996, when we finalized the current constitution of South Africa in May 1996 in Parliament. Now, I think that the big difference between then and now, to go to your question, was that in 1991, after F.W. de Klerk, then the president, unbanned the ANC and inaugurated the negotiations process through the CODESA, Convention for a Democratic South Africa, the majority of South Africans did not have the vote. They were excluded from the formal structures of state power. The monopoly of political power was then held by the white minority and coloureds and Indians to a lesser extent through a tricameral parliament. So how were you going to bridge this gap between those who had the formal political power and those who had the mass power? And so CODESA was created as a means of bringing the system and the struggle together under one roof. And, with a lot of interruptions and false starts, it did achieve its objective. But that was because we had an unusual situation where there was a difference between the real power, which was in the masses, and the formal power, which was in the government that only represented a minority. And that's why we had the convention then, the CODESA convention. But now, of course, as I mentioned, in response to your first question, you've actually got power formalized in the parliament and the legislatures and the provincial governments of South Africa, where everyone has a vote and every voice, theoretically at least, is heard. So I think that is the big difference, that it was absolutely previously necessitated by the absence of structures in which people could participate. Now you've got all the structures in which everyone can participate, and still we find ourselves back having this national conversation. You could say, of course, and I guess the organizers will say this, that there are big weaknesses in our system. And that is quite clear. If you look at the minority of people who actually voted in the last year's general election, if you exclude those who didn't register to vote and the big minority who stayed away, most eligible voters in South Africa did not participate in last year's general election, which means a lot of people sit or stand outside the system. And if the national dialogue can actually bring these people back into the system, then good. But, I remain somewhat skeptical for the reasons I alluded to in my earlier reply.
I am a little curious about what should be talked about at a national conversation like this. And I think you might have given us some clues now in the last part of this answer. So we know the issues: crime, unemployment, economics, you name it. I think everybody understands and knows that those things need to be fixed. But at the heart of all of this, and you started talking about it earlier, is the doing, the governing. And maybe the issue is how we choose the people who do the governing. And I wonder if that isn't what should be top of the list of a conversation like this.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. Look, I think there are a lot of things people, talk is, as they say in the classics, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey. So, I mean, it's one thing to have a conversation. What are you going to do about it? Now, Peter, I could take your point further and say the one thing South Africa doesn't have a shortage of or a lack of information is what its citizens think. We have quite sophisticated polling in this country. We have a lot of pulses taken of national opinion. A lot of that opinion, let me put it frankly to you, I know this is a channel that goes into Africa, doesn't make for that pleasant reading because I think many South Africans, as is a trend across the world, it's not unique to this country, see it in Europe and America, are very hostile to non-South Africans being in South Africa. So if you were to take a national conversation, you'd probably find there's a big xenophobic element in what people want. I remember when I was in the Constitutional Assembly, which birthed the Constitution of South Africa in 1996, we took the Constitution to the people, very similar to this national dialogue, just cheaper. Well, it was then 34 million rand, this is 700 million rand, but you've got to adjust for inflation over 30 years. And we got an enormous blizzard of public responses. What did people want the Constitution? I'll tell you as a fact that most people, many people, a majority, wanted the death penalty to be in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa because they're worried about crime. Well, crime has risen since then. And I suspect if you took a national majority opinion, most people would say, let's have stronger punishment, let's have better policing. So if you're going to listen to what people want, just be careful because they might say things that you, the political elite, and at the end of the day, however citizen-friendly this is, it's the elite who make the decisions. It's the elite who form an eminent persons group. It's the elite who are going to write the reports coming out of this national dialogue. So they might not always like what they hear that the people want, because what the people want and what the Constitution allows and what the government's prepared to do are often very different things.
I had a conversation with a commissioner from Ethiopia who's, I mean, they're going through a process right now, and they've been at it for about 3 years now, a national dialogue of their own. And he said that when they started, there was a lot of mistrust, there was a lot of people who didn't participate, but after a time, people started to see, okay, there is value, and they joined in. Is there any chance that could happen here?
No, of course, there's a chance. And, as I said, I started with a skeptic, but I'm very happy to be proved wrong. I don't want to be only pessimistic. I just, sound some notes of caution because I've been in this rodeo before in different eras. And I also wonder about its utility in the sense that, look, South Africa, with all its sophistication and all its problems, got both in fair measure, confronts some real crises. Now, I mean, and you mentioned them in the introduction. You mentioned the lack of economic growth, the huge amount of unemployment, corruption metastasized from top to bottom across all levels of government, at the heart of the executive of this country, as we see every day with every revelation. And yet, it's not that people don't know these things. It's not that people haven't expressed themselves against these things or in favor of outcomes that will mitigate this or these crises. We know that. But people want a government and which acts on its mandate. And, where I'm perhaps most negative about this national dialogue is, even if they come up with immensely sensible suggestions, a can-do list, how are you going to guarantee that these translate into action? Now, I mean, South Africa has gone through without public participation, but presumably based on what people want, a whole series. We had a national development plan. We had a national planning commission. It was going to put certain things in place to make sure that in 4 years' time, I think, or 5 years' time, 2030 was the outcome. We'd have 5% economic growth. We'd have hugely reduced unemployment. would have doubled the level of investment in the economy. None of these things have happened, even though there are detailed plans to make them happen. So that is why one sounds some notes of caution about what is going to be the actionable outcome of this current exercise or this ongoing exercise.
John Steenhuisen, the Democratic Alliance Party leader, said that this is a stitch-up by President Ramaphosa. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, he sits in Ramaphosa's government, in his cabinet, so he presumably knows far more than I do from the inside. I do find it rather striking. I mean, given that South Africa is a parliamentary democracy and we have this coalition government, that I think the political parties that represent more than half the voters of South Africa are either boycotting this national dialogue or are inactive in it. So you've got the DA, which is the biggest, second biggest party. You've got the MK, you've got the EFF, and you've got various smaller parties who are not attending today. So it already starts off, whether by accident or design or default, as looking more and more something that's crafted in the image of the ANC. And therefore, I guess what Steenhuisen's saying is that Cyril Ramaphosa, the leader of the ANC and the president, is using this to try and bolster the position of the ANC rather than on behalf of the entire public. And that, of course, is perhaps reinforced by the fact that, well, I suppose it has to start from somewhere, is that the driving force of the national dialogue, the operational center, is the office of the president himself. So I think, and you can speak to John Steenhuisen yourself, I'm not a spokesman, that would be where the cynicism of someone like Steenhuisen would arise from. And of course, he has indicated, because of his dissatisfaction with the operation of the government of which he's part, that one of the consequences is that his party is not participating in this. But I mean, there's another party, the Freedom Front, which is in the government, is not participating. And as I say, the major opposition parties outside of government, the MK and the EFF, aren't in it either. So it does start with a structural problem. And, once again, going back to what we discussed earlier in the program, if somehow Deus e mirabilis, we actually emerge from this with something that really does look like it's got momentum, I guess parties might reconsider as they go along. But I think, the onus will be on the national dialogue and its organizers to actually prove that this is something beyond the talk shop, which John Steenhuisen labeled it as. Or national monologue, I think was the word he used, rather than dialogue.
What could be the consequences of this thing failing completely and not delivering anything?
Well, I think, Peter, if that is the fact, it'll just reinforce people's cynicism about a lot of what's gone wrong here at the moment, or is going wrong. And I think just more people will opt out of the constitutional political system, which of course is dangerous, because then various unconstitutional and less democratic options perhaps become more attractive.
I was told also by somebody else this week that because we've got such a young population and they're not voting, that maybe this national dialogue really should have been something that happens in a platform that works for them, and that it becomes a hashtag, and that people communicate online rather than sitting at UNISA and having all these eminent people and that kind of thing. I wonder what your thoughts are, because the average age of a citizen now is well below 20, I understand, across the continent now. So it's young people that are most affected and the highest in number. And so whatever's being discussed really should be about them by and large.
Absolutely. Look, I must, put my hand up, but I'm not involved in this. I'm 68 years old, but I'm young by comparison with some of the leadership in South Africa and Africa. I mean, we have a pretty geriatric leadership. The president's well into his 70s. the leader of the third largest party, Jacob Zuma's in his 80s, the man who was the founding spirits of this national dialogue, Thabo Mbeki, who's currently descending from it, is also in his 80s. So this is not this might be a country of young men and women, but its leadership is old. And you've got some extraordinary examples across Africa of truly gerontocratic leadership out of step with what young people aspire to and want. Look, I happened to be in New York City recently in June when the event of the election of the young, in his early 30s, Democratic Socialist Zoran Mondani was won against every expectation the Democratic primary to become mayor of New York City. And one of the reasons he won was that not only is he young and appealed to young people who'd never voted before or hadn't participated in something like a party primary, but he was able, as someone said, he was a digital native. He could use technologies and platforms that older folk have just got no idea of. So while his opponent, Andrew Cuomo, was putting millions of dollars into television adverts, Mumdani was using TikTok and Snapchat and putting up vertical videos, and that really galvanized a lot of people. So I think it's not just a question of having attractive young spokesmen who speak to and with some authenticity about young people. It's getting to younger people where they're at, and probably that is on those platforms that older people have no idea of how to operationalize.
We're starting to come to the end of our conversation. I'm just wondering, you were a party leader at a very important time in our country's history. If you were party leader now and in the GNU, what would you be pushing for?
Well, what I'd be pushing for, and I can speak with some direct experience because, as you might know, I was actually one of the negotiators of the GNU last year when it was formed. What I'd be pushing for is to hold the government or the president's feet to the fire on actually operationalizing the agreement that was implemented. I think the problem with one of the reasons why we have a dysfunctional government, where really basically people do what they want. I mean, Chief of the Defense Force goes off on apparently a rogue mission to Iran. Who knows whether he had permission, didn't have permission, has a script, doesn't have a script. I don't know. But the actual agreement, the so-called statement of intent, that was signed, solemnly signed in the middle of June last year between the ANC and the DA, and then between the ANC and all the other parties in this government, actually has a set of steps that, if they actually executed and operationalized, would actually lead to joined up government. So if I was a party leader in that government, I would insist that we don't have every party for itself, every minister doing their own thing, but we have a joined up approach to government by instrumentalizing or operationalizing what we agreed to last June. And unfortunately, that agreement has been honored only in its breach. And I think, go back to basics and just say, okay, we're not going any further with this arrangement until we actually implement these steps.
Do you think the GNU will survive?
How long is a piece of string? I don't know. I mean, it stumbles on.
Yeah.
It survives in the sense that it hasn't broken up, which I suppose you could say is something. But in terms of being effective, I mean, just to go back, and I'm sure it's going to come up in this national dialogue, the biggest single propulsive forces that created the spot from the election result was to have higher levels of economic growth and lower levels of unemployment. And frankly, the GNU, on the data that we have, on the lived experience of people, has been a failure in that regard because we have practically no economic growth, never mind the aggravation of the Trump tariff, which is another conversation, and how ineffectively that has been countered. And we have mountainous unemployment. So in terms of the task that the GNU set itself, it hasn't succeeded. So we can say, well, okay, the GNU continues, and it does. I mean, it's still there, and the parties to it have not yet left it. But that's a very low bar. You've got to say, why are you there, and what have you achieved, is the more germane question, I think.
Ambassador Tony Leon, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed. for sharing your
Thank you,
thoughts
Peter.
with us on this day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye bye. Let's